Merry Christmas, everyone. I'm here to share with you a word that I heard and a word that I learned while I was studying the Psalms this morning. A couple of weeks ago, the pastor of the church that I was visiting mentioned that evil is the absence of good, just like darkness is not a thing on its own, it's the absence of life. So, what we get when we take away life and good and light, which is God Himself, He alone is the source, the existence of those things cannot come from anywhere but His presence. When you take Him out, then all you're left with is evil. And that is an interesting way of looking at sin and salvation and God's presence in our lives. It's really revealing and eye opening. And it made me think of this poor little sad poinsettia. If you can't tell, that is actually what it used to be when I got it a few weeks ago on Thanksgiving weekend at Lowe's, and it was lovely when I first bought it. What happened was I didn't actually give it any water, and I didn't really put it directly in the sunshine. So the absence of what it needed, the water, the sunlight, gave it death. And I'm so sorry, poor plant. I killed the poinsettia. I tried to resurrect it, but I couldn't do any of that on my own. It needed that constant source of water and light to be able to thrive and live the way it was supposed to. And that made me think of evil and God. And what we have when we are absent from God is lack of life. Without His presence, when we don't give ourselves daily doses of that, we get death. And it made me think of how much we need Jesus. And today I was reading Psalm 21, and it talks about the King, which now we know is Jesus. But when David wrote this psalm, he was thinking about the king, the actual king of Israel, which was himself. So he was talking about how God granted him victory. But I want you to think about this psalm in the way that Jesus gives us victory over death and over all kinds of things in our lives. You see, it says, you've granted him his heart's desire and have not withheld the request of his lips. Jesus comes to make it so that we are heard before God. That's one thing that he did as Immanuel this season at Christmas. Another thing that I loved about this psalm that made me think of Jesus is that it says in verse 3, you placed a crown of pure gold on his head. Jesus is the only one that deserves that position of king in our lives, that crown of pure gold on the head of Jesus. And then in verse 4, he asked you for life and you gave it to him. This is why it's not just about David. Even when David wrote it, he was being prophetic. Length of days forever and ever. David had to have known he wasn't going to live forever himself. But in the lineage of that coming Messiah that he was prophetically talking about, there was length of days forever and ever. That's what Jesus comes to bring us. He brings us the solution to our neglect of being with God, our absence from the light and the life and the water of life. He brings us eternal life because he is our intercessor. He asks God to give us eternal life, and through him we receive what we can't do on our own. I love this part where it says in verse 5, the victories you gave, his glory is great. Through the victories that God has given to Jesus, victory over death, over darkness, over poverty, that poverty spirit in our lives where we think we're never going to have enough, victory over shame, victory over our health, victory over wounds. Think about the victories that Jesus holds in his hands for you. They may not all be fulfilled right now, but Jesus holds victories over all sorts of things in our lives. And he has a victory specifically for you. Now, that doesn't mean that everything we ask for, all the things that we want victory for, that we'll get them like Jesus is a genie in the bottle Jesus. But he's coming to bring Immanuel, which is light that dispels all that darkness. and He can sustain us as long as we're in this broken place, in this imperfect world, in this mortal body. And He can also deliver us. Some of that deliverance can come now. Some of it will be just through being present with Immanuel as He brings us into that next phase where everything is restored, either now or now and the fulfillment of all of the rest of it in eternity. So that's good news. That's good news that God is not an herbicidal maniac like I am. He does not neglect us. He does not leave us to die. His presence gives us what we need to be sustained now and always. So I pray for you right now that you'll experience Immanuel in a particular victory that He has for you today, a particular kingship moment where you can experience Him and His presence and His light and His life and the water that He can flow into and through you to make your Christmas one that is centered on the joy and the life-giving, light-full promises and truth of His presence with you. Merry Christmas and have a beautiful weekend.